Today on Sugar Spin Run, I'll be showing you how to make my favorite juicy homemade meatballs. Hey Sugar Spin Bakers, Sam here, and today I am so excited to be sharing one of my current favorite dinner recipes with you. This meatball recipe took me so long to get right. I did a ton of research before perfecting it. I think you are going to absolutely love it because the meatballs are so juicy, so full of flavorful. I personally believe this is the best meatball recipe out there, but I'll let you judge for yourself. Now to begin, you are just going to need a small bowl. And we're going to be making what's called a panade. If you haven't made this before, it's super simple. We are going to be making ours just using 3 slices of white bread and a little bit of milk. I'll explain it a little bit more as we go on, but for starters, you're going to want to remove the crust from each slice of bread. Now I'm just tossing mine in my bowl right here. We're actually going to discard these, but I just need a place to put the crust for now. I'm just going to set those aside. My dogs will enjoy the crust later on. Next, you'll want to tear each piece of bread into about 1-inch sized pieces. Just drop those in your bowl. You'll now need 1/2 cup of milk and just pour this evenly over your bread pieces. So rather than use breadcrumbs for this recipe, which can kind of dry out a meatball a little bit, we are using this panade. We're going to let that bread absorb all of that milk, and then this is going to get mixed in with our meat. It's going to trap that moisture, and when you cook your meatballs, they're going to stay nice and juicy. It is a favorite technique of mine when making meatballs. Now, this panade, you're going to want to just toss the breadcrumbs with a fork a little bit until they're all moistened by the milk. We're going to let this sit for about 10 minutes or until the bread is totally saturated with the milk. So once your panade has had about 5 to 10 minutes to sit, you'll want to take your fork and just mash that bread in there, work everything together until it's basically a paste. Looks super appetizing, right? Now we have a few more ingredients we'll be adding in with our panade, starting with 1/3 cup of fresh grated Parmesan cheese. We'll also be adding 1 large egg. We're also going to be adding 3 cloves of garlic, and while you could mince these, my preference is to press them into the panade. A little tricky because I'm doing this backwards so you guys can see. And as you can see, my garlic cloves are pretty large. I like a lot of garlic. If you like a lot of garlic and your cloves are smaller than mine, you can go ahead and use more than 3 cloves. Now we'll add our spices, starting with 1½ teaspoons of dried parsley, a 1/2 teaspoon of onion powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of dried oregano. I like to add a 1/4 teaspoon of crushed red pepper just for a little bit of heat, a teaspoon of salt, a 1/2 teaspoon of ground black pepper, and finally, a classic Italian grandmother's secret ingredient, a 1/4 teaspoon of ground nutmeg. The nutmeg just adds a little bit of depth of flavor. It's really hard to detect it. In fact, I would say you can't pick up on the fact that there's nutmeg on it in the finished product, but it adds a little extra something special to the taste of the meatballs. Now, once you have everything in your bowl, you're going to want to use your fork to stir it together until it's well combined. We'll just slide our panade over to the side, and we are going to need a separate, larger bowl for our meats. Now, for today's recipe, I am using 1 pound of ground beef. This is 90% lean ground beef, but you can use whatever percentage of fat that you would like. We're also going to be using a pound of ground pork. Now, before we go any further, I'm actually going to take a little bit of my ground pork. We'll say 2 tablespoons-ish of the ground pork, and 2 tablespoons-ish of the ground beef. Now we're going to stir this little bit of meat into the panade really well. You want that meat to be really nicely incorporated into the panade. So you probably already know that generally when you're working with ground meats, you don't want to overwork the meat. You want to stir it as little as possible. So it might seem a little bit counterintuitive that we are stirring this little bit of ground beef and ground pork into our panade, and we're stirring it so vigorously. Now, the reason we're doing this is because while I was doing all of my meatball research and trying to figure out the best way to incorporate all of the ingredients without overworking them, I came across this technique that Sear Eats shared about, it's similar to tempering eggs is how he described it. Basically, we are stirring in this little bit of meat really, really well so that when we add it to the rest of our meat, we don't have to work as hard to incorporate all of the ingredients. We can use a lighter hand, and that leaves us with nice, juicy meatballs. So now that we have our panade prepared at this point, we will add it to our ground meat. Doesn't that just look beautiful? Tastes beautiful, trust me on that. We'll want to get all of that in there. And to avoid overmixing, you do want to use your hands to combine all of the ingredients. If you're a little bit squeamish like me, don't want to get anything under your fingernails, you can use gloves like I'm going to. Now, I do recommend doing this by hand because it helps you avoid overworking the meat. I'm really not squeezing the meat as I'm doing this. I'm just gently turning it with my hands. I'm just going to keep doing this until I get everything well incorporated. These gloves are a little bit big on me, so that makes it a little hard because they keep trying to slide off my hands. Now, once everything is beautifully combined, you're going to want to go ahead and toss those gloves. We're going to start portioning out our meatballs. Now, I'm going to be portioning mine into about 2 tablespoon size balls. I like to use a heaping 1.5 tablespoon size cookie scoop to do this. Now, because I want these meatballs to be nice and round, I'm going to be rolling them between my palms, and I'm not going to be using gloves at this point just because that would be a little bit too difficult. However, what I am going to do is I'm going to lightly coat my hands with a little bit of olive oil. I'm just going to pour the olive oil in a dish just a little bit, and I'll just lightly grease my palms, and it keeps the meatball from sticking to my palms while I roll it into a nice round ball. Gently roll it. We'll just repeat until we've rolled all of our meatballs. And you can re-grease your hands as often as you need to. Now we're gonna head over to our stovetop where we will cook our meatballs. Now, I like to use a large Dutch oven for this. This is an enameled cast iron Dutch oven. If you have a straight cast iron, I really don't recommend using that just because you're going to be simmering your meatballs for a while in tomato sauce. So if you use regular cast iron without the enamel, sometimes that tomato sauce will like leach that metallic flavor off of the cast iron and it can compromise the flavor of your sauce. So use an enameled pot or use a large soup pot. Just don't use straight cast iron if you can avoid it. I'm going to set this on my stove top. We're going to add a little bit of olive oil to the bottom of the pot. You want the layer of olive oil to be about 1/8 to 1/4 inch deep. Now we'll heat the oil just a smidge over medium heat until it's shimmering. So once our oil is nice and hot, we can begin to sear our meatballs. Now we're going to cook these meatballs in batches of about 3 to 5 at a time. You don't want to really crowd the pot. Now always make sure you're very careful when you are working with hot oil and be aware that it can splatter and you do not want to burn yourself, so always be careful when adding the meatballs to the pot, removing them from the pot, or just anytime you're around hot oil. So we're going to cook them on one side until they're nice and golden brown. And then we're going to flip them and cook them exactly on the opposite side. Now, if your meatballs are sticking to the pan, just use a rubber or plastic spatula to gently pry them off the bottom. This way they don't fall apart, and then use your tongs to turn them. Now, we're just going to be searing 2 sides of these meatballs. Don't worry that they're not going to be brown all the way around. You might even be able to see a little bit of meat that's still pink. That's okay. We're just going to be searing the meatballs and then they'll finish cooking in the sauce as they simmer. So for now, this is fine. So once the meatballs are browned on both sides, we're going to carefully remove them from the pot. Again, use your spatula to loosen them if you need to. We're going to place them on a clean plate. We'll repeat until we've done this with all of our meatballs. Now, once you've cooked all of your meatballs, you should still have a little bit of grease on the bottom of the pan. Now, if you have more than about 2 tablespoons of grease, I recommend draining it until you only have 2 tablespoons left. If you, for any reason, don't have any grease left in the pot, you're going to want to add a little bit more olive oil. Our pot's looking pretty good. We have just the right amount of grease. I find that when I use 90% lean beef, it usually leaves me with just the right amount of grease in the pot. This is going to add a lot of flavor to our meatballs. And you see those brown bits on the bottom, you don't want to get rid of them. Those also hold a lot of flavor. So we are going to keep on cooking our sauce. Now, the first ingredient that you're going to need is 1 cup of finely chopped yellow onion. I'm going to add this into my pot, and keep in mind my pot is still over medium heat at this point. Now we'll cook this onion until it's translucent, and as we cook it, you're going to want to use your spatula to just gently scrape up any brown bits on the bottom of the pan. Just get the bottom of the pan nice and cleaned up while you're cooking. I mean, it'll look a little bit dirty still, but you don't want those brown bits to stay stuck to the bottom of the pan or they'll start to burn. Now what we're making here is a simple marinara sauce. This is actually basically the same thing as my really popular homemade marinara sauce. I just have simplified it a little bit for this meatball recipe. Now once your onions are nice and translucent and nicely cooked, we're going to add our garlic. You'll need 1.5 tablespoons of minced garlic. We'll just cook this while stirring it until it's nice and fragrant. This just usually takes about 30 seconds. Once you can smell that garlic cooking, you're going to add 28 ounces of crushed tomatoes, 2 teaspoons of dried basil, 2 teaspoons of granulated sugar, which does not make the sauce sweet, but adds a little depth of flavor and helps neutralize the acidity from the tomatoes, 3/4 teaspoon of dried oregano, a 1/2 teaspoon of finely ground sea salt, and a 1/2 teaspoon of ground black pepper. Now you'll want to stir everything together until your ingredients are well combined, and you're going to want to cook until this mixture comes to a simmer. Now once your sauce is simmering, we're going to grab those meatballs that we just browned a little bit ago, and we're going to carefully place them back in the sauce. I know you've got a lot of meatballs here, trust me, they will all fit. Now you want to make sure that all of your meatballs are submerged in the sauce, and then we're going to reduce the heat, but you want to make sure that it's simmering. When everything is simmering, all your meatballs are submerged, we're going to cover the pot with our lid, and you'll let the pot sit covered until your meatballs are cooked through. Now, how long this takes can vary a little bit. Usually it takes about 15 minutes for me. You can also test that your meatballs are cooked all the way through by using a meat thermometer. You want the internal temperature of the meatballs to be over 165 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't have a thermometer and you're worried that your meatballs aren't cooked all the way through, you can remove one from the sauce, cut it in half. So long as it's not pink inside, you should be good to go. And that is how you make my favorite juicy homemade meatballs. I really hope you guys try this one out. Please, if you do, let me know what you think. I always love hearing from you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. These are hot. That is a good meatball.